Good morning. My name is Haley Oliver, and I'm the Interim Vice Provost for Graduate Students and Postdoctoral Scholars at Purdue University and the Director of the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Food Safety. We really appreciate that you've joined us today to talk about or hear from our experts in social behavior change and food safety. I'd like to draw your attention to some of the technical features of our webinar today. First of all, there's closed captioning available at the bottom of the screen. We highly encourage you to use the question and answer function if you have questions throughout the presentation. Some will be answered live by our experts. Others we will save for the panel discussion at the end of the presentations. And there's going to be availability of the slides through the chat. So we are sharing links to the slides for presentations in the chat. And if you have any trouble viewing the presentations today, we invite you to use the links to open the slides on your own computer. We will also email links to the recording and presentations to all attendees in the next week. So the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Food Safety, or FISL as we call ourselves, was established in 2019 with funding from Feed the Future, the U.S. government's global hunger and food security initiatives. FISL is jointly managed by Purdue and Cornell universities, and we leverage global food safety expertise in locally led projects that address the root causes of foodborne illness. By identifying food safety knowledge gaps and developing data-driven food safety practices and policies, FISL projects aim to create systematic change that strengthens households and community nutrition, food security, and economic opportunity. Our research and engagement activities have focused on four main goals: increasing stakeholder awareness of food safety issues, impacts, and measures to reduce food safety risks, building local research capacity and conducting research on regional food safety challenges, supporting translation and dissemination networks to develop policies and engagement structures, and enhancing local capacity to translate food safety research into training, guidelines, and commercialized products. Our work has also incorporated the cross-cutting themes of empowerment of women, youth, and other marginalized populations, human and institutional capacity development, and food safety enabling environments. FISL's research portfolio focuses on nutrient-dense, perishable foods, including dairy, poultry, fish, and vegetables. Our target countries have included Bangladesh, Cambodia, Kenya, Nepal, Nigeria, and Senegal. In all of our projects, we have aimed to address the multidimensional nature of food safety. Of course, microbiology and toxicology knowledge gaps require assessing the risk of foodborne disease from pathogens and contaminants and identifying critical control points, effective practices, and data-driven policies. However, social and behavioral sciences help transform knowledge into meaningful change. This requires understanding the motivations for and obstacles to adopt food safety practices and developing effective outreach programs to actually strengthen food safety practices. In addition, for food safety practices and policies to be feasible, they must be economically viable, which is why it's important to assess the demand for safer foods and the costs and benefits to producers and communities to inform market-led food safety policies. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome researchers from four of our projects to share their results through the lens of social behavior change. Information about their broader approach and project activities will be shared through links in the chat. A better understanding of the beliefs, motivations, and economic pressures that influence food safety behaviors across the food system can yield more effective outreach programs and policy recommendations. Thus, progress in food safety is driven by behavior change. Today's panelists will share their insights on food safety and social behavior change among consumers, producers, and vendors in Bangladesh, Cambodia, Nepal, and Senegal. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Aditya Kanal, and I invite him to share his presentation. Dr. Aditya Kanal is an associate professor of agriculture economics and agribusiness at Tennessee State University and the principal investigator of the Food Safety Innovation Labs project in Nepal. Dr. Kanal is the current chair of the South Asia section of the American Agriculture and Applied Economics Association, or the AAEA. Kanal's agriculture and applied economics research portfolio, including food safety, food security, and interdisciplinary areas in the U.S. and South Asia, has produced nearly 70 research publications, numerous conference papers, and book chapters. Kanal has received an Outstanding Young Scholar Award for Agriculture, Finance, and Management from the AAEA, and is the 2023 Emerging Scholar Award from the Southern Agricultural Economics Association. Aditya, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Oliver, for nice introduction. So today I'll be sharing some of our findings and insights from our study in Nepal. Uh, so I'll be sharing more on the producer behavior side of our study. Um, Talking about the food safety scenario in Nepal. So Nepal has been long been emphasized on food security aspects from several decades, but more or so towards meeting the hunger requirement goals in several decades in the past. But recently, as you can see in this graph, I have shown the global hunger index. So Nepal has done good progress in mitigating the hunger. Mitigating the hunger, reducing the hunger, so it has moderate or low level of hunger requirement. So this is the time for the Nepal to emphasize more on the broader definition of food security, which makes to ensure food is safe, nutritious, more towards the food safety and nutritious goals, and which has been realized by Nepal government, and as Nepal government is emphasizing on food safety as a priority in recent few years, at least in last decades. So food safety is an emerging priority in Nepal on that aspect. However, because it is an emerging priority, there are several levels of limited understanding about food safety, what exactly food safety is, what it can compromise, specifically coming to the microbiological risk associated with it, like microbiological contamination risks, limited understanding, not only among consumers and producers, but also on the government officials level, and then extension and outreach officers level. So we emphasized on fresh produce for this project in Nepal, because when fresh produce is consumed raw, it is at risk of causing foodborne illnesses when it is contaminated, because it is often consumed raw. So when it is contaminated, it has more susceptible to bring foodborne illnesses. So before doing the producer behavior study, as a part of the project, we had the consumer household survey and willingness to pay experiment doing on the consumer behavior studies, which kind of reflect that there is a potential for a positive price premium for food safety attributes of fresh produce, which is an indication of there could be a potential to develop a market-led uh, demand-based food safety attributed fresh produce in the market. So then the question on the producer studies, understanding the producer behavior is, have the fresh produce growers adopted good agricultural practices that meet food safety needs? And if they have not met, then what could be the potential obstacles of why they have not adopted those good agricultural practices? And what are the level of understanding on different aspects of food safety, about microbial contamination, chemical contamination, foodborne illness, physical, chemical, and microbial contamination? What do the producer understand? And going in depth a little bit on that, so if producers are willing to incur some cost, are they willing to incur some additional cost to maintain the food safety? If they are willing to incur costs, how much they potentially are willing to incur those costs. So we try to answer these questions, at least investigate those questions through our study in Nepal. It's a short-term study, around 2 years project in Nepal. So I'll be sharing some of the findings. So first thing about how we did it is, we had randomly selected commercial vegetable growers all across the Nepal, nation-based survey from 10 districts representing all 7 provinces, which comprises, which includes all vegetable production main pocket areas of the districts. And we did survey through in-person interviews using the trend enumerators, and then we asked questions to each farmers using those trend enumerators through in-person interviews. Um, So here are some of the representative findings I want to share with you regarding our first questions about the good agriculture practices. Uh, we designed the questionnaire with the help of our food safety expert, which is Food Safety Outreach, who is working on small to medium-sized and commercial fresh produce growers. So we have set of questions to see good agricultural practices, whether they have adapted or not. Here, as you can see in the graph, the yellow area representing the no for that adopting those practices. You can see there is a critically low number, just a handful of farms, sample farms have their food safety plans, and they have critically lacking the safer water plans, or like checking the irrigation regularly. And as you can see, here, 99.8% they do not test irrigation water for microorganism contaminations, and only 99% they have not a written food safety plan. They do not check the farm and irrigation water yearly. As you can see, those 99%, these are the no. And also, another important aspect is in fresh produce grower in Nepal, it is common to use manure, farmyard manure, and the compost. And we asked critical questions about those manure. As you can see, around 10% of sample household, they are using directly the raw manure in producing food safety, in producing their fresh produce, and their livestock and animal facilities just next to the vegetable growing area, including the fresh, leafy vegetables. They have the animal component right next to them, which is critically important for food safety standpoint, have a cross-contamination there. We also asked some questions about the good agriculture practices related to chemical safety and record keeping practices. So as you can see, 88.8% they express that they follow the waiting period after pesticide applications. However, when we ask them, do you do regular record keeping of the fertilizer and chemical applications and compost, only 15.5%, as you can see, we're maintaining those proper records there. And as you can see, 93.4% do not check for the pesticide residuals on their fresh produce. And also, I have presented here some of the representative handling and hygiene practices as a good agriculture management, whether they adopt or not. And you see there is critically the yellow big one. That means significant portion are not using the handling and hygiene practice. Those who have adopted some of them also needs improvement on those, as you can see here. So sharing with that, the next step for us is to why there is a gap, or why low or no adoption of good agriculture practices there. And we looked at the literature and then our common understanding based on our experience in Nepal, and also talking through focus group discussion with extension agents as well as government officials. We kind of come up with these insights and hypotheses. Um, some of the literature from developing country context, which may be relevant to Nepal as well. So I have presented there the potential obstacles. One definitely could be the expenses of adopting these safety measures. It requires a additional cost to maintain those good agriculture practices and food safety measures. And another important would be the awareness level. So what is the implication of not adopting good agricultural practices, or what even the lack of understanding of what exactly food safety means on the microbiological risk side, and does it could be a cross contamination through water, also cross contamination through manure. So those are the poor understanding related to that. And another obstacle could be the difficult procedures for certifications and ambiguity, or no clarity on some of the aspects on that. And finally, the gaps in policy, regulations, and outreach are communicating well about all those aspects, as well as the incentives or disincentivization mechanisms for if they are not addressing safety behavior, what would be the disincentivization mechanism, or the kind of regulation policy gap also there. So to see the question in depth, we did a little bit of bidding experiment, whether the producers are willing to incur some of the costs related to food safety, and if they are incurring the cost, so how much cost they they are willing to incur. So we did this through a bidding experiment. So we elicited their willingness to accept in a percentage basis what additional cost you will be you will be willing to incur to maintain food safety in your farm. So we did that, something called using this double-bounded dichotomous choice experiment under contingent evaluation framework. The main idea, I don't want to explain every detail of it, but the main idea of it is you presented the initial bid, like, do you willing to incur 10% additional cost to maintain the food safety in your farm? If their answer is yes, then it goes for the further yes and no, the second level. If it is no, and then it again asks for with the lower bid. So first bid, and then it goes towards the follow-up bid. So with that, so each of the farmer will have, we can divide it at least into, like, they fall into four different options, right? There could be either for the initial bid, yes, and then followed by the follow-up bid, yes, the YY, and initial bid, yes, but no, with that no for the follow-up bid. And initial bid, no, but yes for the follow-up bid, or no for that option. So with that, so we using the mathematical model under this the DBDC frameworks, we computed the probability of each of these options, and we make it something called the likelihood function. So with that, what it does is it estimates the likelihood of each of the respondent to have this willingness to accept on that, with controlling for several factors, which I have shown here. So expected willingness to accept is a function of several factors that which are related to this one, and how much extent they are related will be captured by beta, and just explaining in a plain language. So what we found from that is willingness to accept is so those who are higher willingness to accept for food safety practices, they are relatively higher educated. They have relatively bigger farm size. They relatively perceive themselves as relatively low risk averse than the high risk averse, and they have higher credit access. So higher credit access farms, those who have higher credit access, they were more likely to adopt higher willingness to accept that. Also significantly negatively influenced by the growers' use of an intermediate marketing channel. So regarding the marketing channel, we give them the options for 5 different marketing channels. Intermediate marketing channel here is the definition of those who have selling through direct to consumer are those selling directly to the consumer through the farm gate or through the farmers market, while intermediate marketing channel are selling to the restaurants. They are indirectly are selling to the retailers indirectly, so not direct to the consumer. So we found that those who have this intermediate marketing channel used as compared to direct to marketing channel, they are less likely to have additional willingness to accept for additional food safety. And based on this, our double-bounded dichotomous model, we estimated through interval regression. So we predicted that the producers, fresh produce growers in Nepal are willing to incur on an average an additional cost of 13% to maintain food safety. That's the prediction from our model. So with that, definitely from our findings there, and then our discussions with informal discussions, in Nepal, some positive behavioral changes are needed in awareness, knowledge on the incentives, and then support policies to drive those changes. And as a part of the project, we have initiated some of the interventions, which I have bulleted here. Some of those, we developed the growers manual in English and Nepali language to facilitate them. to adopt good agricultural practices. Then we had a training on different areas for growers, ensuring participation of women. And then we try to publish even in Nepal's national journal, so that it may have the more direct impact in the field, like Nepal Public Policy Review Journal, which is from the Policy Research Institute of Nepal, and Agriculture Development Journal, which is directly from the Ministry of Agriculture and Livestock Services in Nepal. We had policy brief published and shared that with government stakeholders through a policy consultation workshop we organized there. And we had presentations in government stakeholder meetings. Those are some of the initial efforts we made as a part of the project to drive these positive behavioral changes, and there is a lot more to do on these aspects, as we see a lot of obstacles there. With that, thank you, and I'll be here to answer any of your questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Aditya. And 13%, I mean, I think it's still an impressive number, what people are willing to, what resources they're willing to contribute to really improve food safety, which I think, again, important part of how we make decisions around food safety. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Paul Ebner, and I invite him to share his screen, which he already is. Dr. Ebner is Department Head and Professor of Animal Sciences at Purdue University with responsibilities in teaching, research, and extension. He serves as co-lead principal investigator of the Food Safety Innovation Labs project in Cambodia. His research focuses on food safety and the development of practical and effective production methods and technologies to limit bacterial pathogens in both live animals and animal-sourced foods. Dr. Ebner was awarded the Outstanding Extension Specialist Award from Purdue's College of Agriculture, a Leadership Award from Purdue University Cooperative Extension Association, and he was named a Purdue University Faculty Engagement Scholar. Paul, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. What I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about an instrument that we've created that we hope can kind of facilitate adoption by looking at what types of practices might be more adoptable than others for different communities. So I'm going to start by oversimplifying the problem, and that foodborne illnesses are largely preventable. It's actually not too much of an oversimplification. So unlike a lot of infectious diseases, which are largely preventable as well, foodborne diseases, the person to develop the illness, the person has to come in direct contact with that pathogen. These are not pathogens that spread very well horizontally. And by definition, that contact has to come through food. So in many ways, they are largely preventable. And this is sort of the framework that we've been using. That kind of drives positive food safety outcomes. One is identifying what the cause of the illness is. Is it everyone's getting salmonella and they're getting it from this type of food? And then identifying what can you do to reduce the illness. So these are all the technologies that we have. And we have a huge body of technologies that are very effective at eliminating or reducing or controlling at least bacterial populations, harmful ones, in different foods or different environments. Where things sometimes break down is this third step, is what will people actually do to reduce the illness? So these are preventable. And what that means is someone has to do something though. So they may have to implement a new practice, or they may have to stop doing something. So you can see this in various things. An example would be quitting smoking is an example of a behavior. Someone, they changed their behavior and they had to do that to get this certain outcome. So what we've tried to do is come up and develop this tool that relies heavily on behavior theory and use it as a diagnostic tool to see, kind of predict which types of practices are more adoptable. And if they're not adoptable, why are they not adoptable? And if we can find that out, perhaps we can create an intervention that improves that adaptability. So I'm going to give you some nuts and bolts about this. So we use a model that's colloquially referred to as COM-B. The COM is capability, opportunity, and motivation, and the B is behavior. And this is actually a distillation of about 30 different behavior theory frameworks into a framework that's operational. So that means people like me can use it. I can understand it. And the basic tenet of this is that behaviors are driven by an individual or community's perceptions of whether they're capable of doing the behavior, whether they have the opportunity to do the behavior, and whether they're motivated to do the behavior. So these conditions have to be met on certain levels for certain behaviors. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to measure or assess at least these conditions as they relate to a certain food safety practice. So in developing the tool, these are largely unobservable variables. And you can't just say, well, what are you motivated to do this? And someone says yes, and we're like, great, let's go on. So we look at that COM-B model, and we have those three constructs of capability, opportunity, and motivation. And then we flesh them out with another framework that's called the total domains framework. And you can see how that total domains framework fits very nicely with the COM-B framework. And we'll look at motivation for a second, because the previous speaker did talk about motivation. And instead of saying, are you motivated to do this? We would look at all the different factors that might go into motivation. You know, it might be their social professional role. We ask, do other people expect you to do this? Do other people or do your consumers expect you to do this? A big one is belief about consequences. And a lot of times we reduce motivation down to money, and that is a big motivation. But we're asking questions saying, if you did this, do you think you would make more money? Or do you think you would have new markets? Or do you think you'd have new customers? So we look at all those different facets of capability, opportunity, and motivation, and try and see if any of those conditions are deficient. And if so, if we can enhance or maximize those conditions. So when we're building this tool, we built it based on these constructs, and on the bottom, you'll see the survey items. So you can say for capability, we have 5 survey items that deal specifically with capability, another 7 that are opportunity, and then 13 that are dealing specifically with motivation. Sorry about that. So what we do originally is, we go through a process of face validation, testing these questions with small groups, and then we take it out in the field to do a pilot study. We have to make sure that this instrument is validated. So it's one thing that we want to know that everyone's understanding the questions in the exact same way. But we also want to know that they're understanding them in the same way that we're understanding them, i.e. we're asking the question we think we're asking. So I'm just going to give you some of the sample data of this process. On the right is a correlation plot, and it's looking at the questions, the answers to the questions in these different sections of capability, opportunity, and motivation, and looking at whether or how much they correlate. Because if someone is highly motivated for something, they will tend to answer those questions similarly if those questions are actually asking about motivation. So then we take that and we revise. We can kind of identify which questions don't fit, or which questions maybe correlate too much across these constructs, and maybe we can make them a little bit clearer, make them more specific for that construct. And then we've taken that and we use those data and we try and fit a model, which is a standard practice in survey validation. So to see if we can explain the variance with this model. So from there, we've used this instrument. The first time we used it was actually in Cambodia, and we used it to measure the likelihood of adoption of food safety practices in vegetable farmers, distributors, and vendors in Siem Reap and Battambang. And those are the 2 areas in Cambodia where we're primarily working. And we do this with one-on-one interviews. And it's This is an entirely quantitative survey, but we're reading questions out, we're showing scales, we're making sure everyone understands questions properly. And we've done this in this study right here. We did it with 169 participants across those different groups. So it produces a significant amount of data. And I'm not going to go through all that, but I'm going to show you some samples of what that looks like. So on the left, you have responses within constructs. So looking at capability, and then you have the different types of groups in the key on the bottom. On the right, it's looking at that a little bit differently. We're taking the capability, opportunity, and motivation of the different groups individually. So this gives you a kind of a start to see, you know, if it's give you a first indication of whether this practice is something that is readily adoptable. And if it's not, for instance, if it's something like people are very motivated to do it and they have the opportunity to do it, they just don't know how to do it, that's probably the best case scenario, because that just means, frankly, showing how it's done. And once people know how it's done, this is something that you see with cleaning and disinfecting a lot. People are motivated to do it. They have the opportunity to do it. It's not an expensive thing, and it's can be done very quickly and easily. They just don't know how to do it yet. So that's just a matter of looking, okay, that construct capability is low in this group. So that's where we're going to focus. That's where our interventions are going to be focused on increasing their perception of their capability to do this. So we also teamed with some statisticians. And if you look at this COM-B framework, you'll see these arrows. And we wanted to see if these arrows are really pointing in the right direction. So, you know, does capability influence motivation, and opportunity influence motivation? And all three of them collectively and by themselves influence that behavior. So we took the different survey items that reflective of the different TDF domains. And we looked to try and see if we can develop these networks across these different items. And this was largely, I have to move my screen. This is Verinda. She was at Ohio State, and this was under the direction of Nora Bello, who's now a statistician, but now at USDA ARS. So what we found is that it largely fits, and not perfectly, and that's to be understood because it's a very simplified model. But you do see these networks where these different items are influencing. So this COM-B theoretical framework that we're using is actually very functional, and that very simplified diagram showing the arrows and how they influence each other has evidence that it's true. So we are at the point right now, we know that this COM-B model is a framework, and in this study at least, we've found some of the potential barriers that we might see if we're trying to encourage or facilitate adoption of food safety practices in these audiences. What I don't have on here is that the same groups that were able to distill these behavior theories into something very operational also have a taxonomy of the interventions that you could pick from that might be most appropriate for your given goal of enhancing, say, capability or enhancing motivation. There's a large family of about 93 these types of interventions, and they've, again, they're in their distillation, they've whittled it down to 9. So this is really helpful because it kind of points out what types of interventions might be effective in increasing or facilitating adoption of food safety. So some of them are very simple, some of it's in education. So that would be the case that I just talked about, where people are highly motivated, they have the opportunity to do it, they just don't know how to do it. Just a simple education program about talking about how to do these things might be very efficient, might be very effective. And on the other side of the scale, there are interventions that largely deal with restriction. So a restrictive intervention would be, you can't sell this product unless you have this permit, unless you go through this training. So there's a time and a place for all these interventions, and this tool, we hope to develop it in such a way that it can be kind of a diagnostic tool. Similar to when you go to the doctor and you might fill out a questionnaire to determine if you're maybe at risk of heart disease or other types of maladies. We hope to do it, hope to develop it in a very simple to use manner like that. And then accompany that with, you know, if you're looking at this, if this motivation is very, very low across the board, these are the types of interventions that might be effective at increasing that motivation and thereby facilitating the adoption of those practices. So with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Oliver. And again, thank you. And I'll hand it with the next speaker.
Thanks so much, Paul. And we encourage you to continue to place your questions in the chat. And Paul, yours are certainly starting to stack up. So we'll have a panel discussion at the end of the presentations where we will address as many of your questions as is possible. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jessica Marder-Kenyon, an assistant research scientist at the University of Georgia with expertise in human geography, rural development, and the gender and youth dimensions of agri-food systems in sub-Saharan Africa. As co-principal investigator with the Food Safety Innovation Lab and gender specialist within the PINA Innovation Lab management entity, she has worked with in-country collaborators in Senegal to plan and implement the gender strategy, research, and monitoring evaluation capacity for the Food Safety Innovation Lab's project in Senegal. Over to you, Jessica.
Thank you, Haley. Great, hopefully you can all see my slides. It's very good to be here today. I wanted to thank the Food Safety Innovation Lab for funding our research and for organizing this webinar. I should say that I'm speaking on behalf of our project team, which is an interdisciplinary international group of social scientists and food safety experts based in Senegal and the United States. And in particular, I'd like to extend a special thanks to my colleagues on the social science side, Mamadou Berry and Papa Kane at BAM and Mariam Balko at SERA. Today, I'll specifically be discussing some of our research findings as they relate to opportunities for private sector behavior change in the dairy value chain in Senegal. To give you a bit of context or orientation to dairy production in Senegal, the commercial sector is totally dominated by large-scale processors who reconstitute powdered milk, which is imported from Europe, mainly France. And that situation has, it's a historical development. It's partly a result of favorable trade policies. So there's no taxation on powdered milk. And that makes it very difficult for domestic processors and dairy producers to compete. So in line with the Feed the Future mandate and the goals of the Food Safety Innovation Lab, we wanted to make sure that we were focused on the domestic dairy value chain in Senegal, where milk production involves both migratory pastoralist populations and increasingly sedentary agriculturalists who also manage dairy cows. We identified one promising opportunity for Senegal's domestic sector, lying within the so-called mini dairy system. So mini dairies are small-scale artisanal milk processing facilities like the one that you see in the picture on the bottom right. They're usually located in secondary or tertiary cities and towns close to the milk production zones in the north of Senegal. And there are several dozen mini dairies currently in operation. Many of them are owned and managed by women. Many dairies rely on the collection of local milk, though some also use milk from herds that are owned by the dairy. In some cases, producers bring their raw milk directly to the dairy facility. In others, a delivery agent will visit nearby households to collect the milk and bring it back. Some of the main issues that are facing mini dairy operators include the quality of the milk collected, also difficulties with capitalization and weak public and governmental support, as well as the irregularity of the milk supply. So there's these huge fluctuations between the dry and rainy seasons in Senegal, partly as a result of seasonal herd migration and then just general fodder availability. So we were working up in the north of Senegal, as I mentioned, which is where domestic dairy production is concentrated. That's also the USAID zone of influence. And the findings that I'm presenting today come from two surveys that we conducted in 2023. The first was a survey with owner-operators of 9 mini dairies, so 3 in each of the regions in our study area. And then second, we conducted surveys with individuals living in households that sold milk to those 9 mini dairies. And we surveyed up to 3 people in each household who were directly involved in dairy production. And we also conducted focus groups before this data collection, before the quantitative data collection effort. In terms of the opportunities and strengths that we observed on the mini dairy side, operators definitely care about food safety. I'll show you on the next slide that all of the operators reported being concerned about contaminated raw and processed milk. All of the mini dairies also reported rejecting milk on a weekly basis, following quality checks. So they typically use alcohol or boiling tests. For most of the dairies, they were rejecting less than 5% of the milk per week, which is good. But some of the dairies report rejecting a lot more, as you can see from that figure. In general, though, we view it as a positive sign that dairies are already engaged in this practice. The fact that there's this existing rejection structure that producers are aware of and generally accept means that we might be able to map on additional food safety tests and thresholds to that structure. Also, just as a side note, which I'll come back to in the conclusions, we found that milk delivered directly by the producer to the dairy is more often rejected by the dairy, possibly because the collectors are engaged in some sort of triage at the farm, or because the milk spends less time in transport. Most, though not all, of the dairies have received some training in food safety. We asked also about hand washing, disinfecting equipment, and other food safety practices, and found that most dairies at least report employing those practices. So there are some training needs remaining that we identified, but it does seem like many dairy operators are, they've taken food safety on board and are open to engaging in further behavior change. At least that's what they reported to us. Nonetheless, the mini dairy owners still identified food safety issues as a major problem for their operations. We asked for their impressions regarding the source of contamination and also asked about how they thought they could, how food safety could be improved within their operations. And they really highlighted problems at the producer level, that the people responsible for small-scale milk production aren't employing the right practices, because they haven't been well trained around food safety issues, and or because they don't have financing or other forms of support to improve their practices. Besides milk rejection, dairy operators felt that they had little ability to influence producers. The second, transport and energy infrastructure pose huge problems for addressing food safety and quality issues. The weather in Senegal is often very dry and hot, and processors have to cover large distances to reach market. So refrigeration and cold chain are critical, but often lacking in northern Senegal. Some of the mini dairy operators mentioned aspects related to the institutional environment. So one of those was financing. Less than half of the dairies that we interfaced with take out loans to support their businesses. And training was another. So many dairies reported not receiving much in the way of consistent information or support from the government or the industry associations that they're members of. And finally, thinking about the social context, I mentioned that many of the dairies are owned or operated by women. And a third of the women dairy operators that we spoke to reported facing gender-related constraints to improving their practices. So for example, being unable to control income associated with dairy production and processing sales meant that they couldn't invest in improved practices. So we also found that, through the producer survey, that many dairies' assessment of producers was certainly echoed by these results. So as you can see from the table there, the overwhelming majority of producers that we spoke with have no access to information or support for dairy production. And their knowledge and practices related to hygiene and food safety are less than ideal. 23% of the households that we interviewed reported that if milk is rejected by the dairy or another market client, they still consume it within the household. Concern about milk-borne illness is also very low. So only about 5% of our respondents reported ever seeing someone feel sick after consuming milk that was produced within the household. but they were concerned about the impact of low quality or contaminated milk on their sales. So something like 80% of our respondents felt that they could increase their sales if their products were of higher quality. We hypothesize that while producers do need education around hygiene and food safety practices, they may not be willing or able to actually change their behavior unless resource constraints are addressed. So we asked producers what would assist them in increasing their production capacity and ability to commercialize milk and milk-related products. And this was fairly similar to what we heard from the mini dairy operators, but included things like access to finance, cold chain, and transport infrastructure. So just to wrap it up here, I think, we found certainly that institutional and policy environments, that sort of enabling environment is weak and a roadblock to behavior change within the private sector. I lump infrastructure in with those as well. Some of those aspects of the enabling environment, like cold chain, electricity, safe water access are common across Senegalese sectors. Others are somewhat more specific to the dairy value chain. And specifically, I think that very little attention or assistance has been provided to domestic dairy producers and processors to the extent that the government has focused on domestic cattle. It's really been focused on vaccination campaigns and herd management. And that's resulted in a severe lack of finance, training, and coherence within the sector. From our focus groups and discussions as a team, we think that there may be some creative solutions that could be employed to resolve some of those finance and training barriers that we identified. Collective organizing could be one. Dairies mentioned that accessing good packaging was a problem for them. So there was a suggestion that they could work together to form a local brand or to collective bargaining to get packaging produced in bulk. I think there are opportunities to mobilize corporate social responsibility. So political pressure could be put on the powdered milk sector to get them to set aside a portion of profits for financing and training individual and artisanal producers. And then in terms of communicating messages to this population, again, many of them can't necessarily read and write, but 83% of those who reported receiving some information about dairy production got it from the TV, phone, or radio, not an extension agent or neighbor. So I think leveraging those alternative media is a good idea. And finally, I just think that it's important to underscore that tensions can exist between what's good for food safety and what's good for the provision of other social goods, including women's empowerment. We don't want a situation wherein the formal private sector creates standards that result in either further impoverishment for producers or the concentration of contaminated dairy within producer households. And we also don't want messaging around food safety to turn people off to consuming local dairy products. So although this is easier said than done, when coming up with interventions, we do need to think about win-win opportunities that encompass food safety improvements along with things like poverty reduction and women's empowerment. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Jessica. And I think your points at the end are extremely important. There are tensions in the give and take. And I think we have another question in the chat that kind of gets at a similar angle of this is the interplay between demands for food safety and its impact in food security. So again, continue to ask your questions in the chat. Some we're answering in the chat, others we will answer live in the discussion. After our final presentation, who I invite Dr. Matende to share his slides, as he is an agricultural economist at Texas State University with 35 years of experience in teaching, research, outreach, and governance in a variety of agriculture and natural resource contexts. He serves as principal investigator of the Food Safety Innovation Lab project in Bangladesh, and he has worked with many academic and research organizations conducting research on several subsectors of agriculture and natural resources, including crops, livestock, and fishery. Over his career, he has led and implemented a number of pioneering, innovative, and interdisciplinary agriculture projects in the U.S., Asia, and Africa. Over to you, Dr. Day.
Good morning. I hope you can hear me. So what I am going to share is a story from Bangladesh, and this time on fish. So we would be spending next 10 minutes briefly sharing some of the key messages. So in this presentation, you'll see we will be highlighting the consumer behavior and how we bring those consumer behavior into the production practices, because we would like to have consumers' information back to the production system so that we could produce whatever is demanded by the consumers. So here is a cartoon I just like to share. I normally share this with my student all the time. We live now in a value chain era. We are not in the supply chain era where we produce and then try to sell. That's not the case. We just like to know what consumer want. We like to integrate the consumer's knowledge into the supply chains and then have a proactive knowledge-based relationship. That's what we did in Bangladesh in action research projects we are conducting, and I will be sharing some of the results over the next 8 or so minutes. So it is a multidisciplinary project, as I mentioned, but our focus here would be experimental auction and choice experiment that we did and collected information on consumers' preferences. And you will see here, we had many other activities in the project which are not covered in this presentation today. But you'll see here, we also grow the fish in a safer environment, and we compare that with the existing production practices. As I said, it is an action research, and we try to incorporate producer, consumers' knowledge, consumers' behavior into the production practices. So here is the my cartoon framework for this study. You will see here, this is not for the whole project, but particularly for the component we are discussing in this presentation. So you'll see here, we have this survey that would be a choice experiment we'll be talking about. Here is the experimental auction we did. We grow, as I say, we grow fish in our trial pond, and then we also have control ponds, and then we collected the fish from both control and trial pond, and we estimate microbial content, heavy metal, as well as antibiotic residues. And combining all of this information, we try to estimate consumers' willingness to pay for safer fish, and from there, how we could get a marketing and pricing strategy. So for the experimental auction, we work on 3 fish species: tilapia, pangasius, and rohu. You might ask why we choose these 3 species, because this represents different consumers group. Rohu is a fish preferred by Bangladeshi consumers, and it is a Indian carps. And then tilapia and another preferred species, then introduced species. Pangasius is least preferred among consumers. It's relatively cheaper fish, and it consumed by poorer consumers. So I just wanted to share with you why we choose these 3 species. And we did experimental auction in 3 different locations that represent 3 different areas of Bangladesh: Mymensingh, Patuakhali, and Narayanganj. For rohu, we did it in 2 sites, one in Mymensingh, one in Narayanganj. In this slide, we try to share with you the results of our experimental auction. Let me spend a minute or so on this slide. This is an important slide. So on the left side of the panel, you will see without information. On the right side of the panel, you see with information. What does it mean is that first we went, this is a vicary auction method, so we followed, and here is an actual fish. We took the fish from the control pond, and we took also the pond from our trial pond. And without giving any information to the consumer from where these fish are coming, they just looked at the fish and then they bid for it. Now, here I just like to share one thing, particularly for consumers and participants here from the developed countries, including USA. Unlike in USA, here we see in Bangladesh, buy fish whole. So skin color, scale color, glossiness of the fish, it does matter a lot. Size of the fish does matter a lot. So we put the two types of fish side by side, and then without any information as to whether they have what kind of antibiotic residue, what kind of microbial content, without informing them from where these fish are coming, they just bid for this fish. And you will see in general, you will see trial fish has a higher price compared to the control fish. Normally, because when we grow in a safer environment, cleaner water, etc., fish looks more glossier and it looks more shiny. Gill colors are important, because there's another thing consumers always do. I have done this in Bangladesh many times. Open the gill and see whether the gill color is red, whether there is a smell coming from the gill, because that's represent bacterial contamination, etc. So by looking at the fish, they did this bidding. And then we provided them the information about the sources of fish, and then the all these microbial and heavy metal and antibiotic residue results. And then you will see here for the trial fish, price has increased further. For control fish, because when they knew all these things, it reduced in some cases. So the next slide essentially explained the same thing, but in words instead of numbers and graphs. So fish culture following good aquaculture practices are more appealing to the consumer than the locally available fish. Even, as I said earlier, despite being unaware of the specific invisible attributes and the production practices, consumers are willing to pay a higher premium price for the safer fish. And when they knew about the laboratory test and the result from the sources of the production, they pay higher price. In fact, consumers demonstrate higher, female consumers demonstrate higher willingness to pay. A couple of days later, our team member, Samina Lutfa, will present that result. Hopefully, you will be able to join that meeting too. In this slide, essentially what we did, the previous slide talked about a kind of an average analysis, and then we did statistical analysis. So I'll not go into the details of the difference in difference model. The story here is that you'll see here that row. So that row essentially shows the consumer willingness to pay for safer fish when they have information about safety and management practices. And here you will see 28% higher for rohu, and it could go all the way up to 33% and to about 28% for tilapia. So that represents the statistical analysis there. So we went further and then did some analysis trying to differentiate two groups of consumers. One is the high safety concern, another with the low safety concern. This is the computer work, and we see that about 33% to 37% of the consumers can be called a high food safety concern, and for Pangasius is about 25%. If you go to this slide, and you will see that the people who have high safety concern, they are willing to pay much more higher. Implication is that when we are first entering into the market, first 33% of the tilapia demand would be met with these high safety concerned people, and then they are willing to pay higher prices. So that's the good news for the producer. So what we did here, after going through the parallel to the experimental auction, we also did choice experiment. So the mainly difference is that earlier in the experimental auction, we were dealing with the real fish. Here we are dealing with the paper fish. Normally we talk about paper tiger, paper lion, and here is the paper fish. And then we did this choice experiment, and then we got the similar result. We'll see here, these are the significant variables: production environment, gill color, etc., are important, including the importance of certification and inspection. So what are the two interventions we did? I'll finish it in 1 minute because we followed the good aquaculture practices. Another thing we did, we built the awareness about the safer feed practices, and we collaborated with the feed industry. They participated in the process, and when we do this, cost of production decreases because we could reduce the cost of feed by eliminating unnecessary ingredients. So here is what I like to share is what happened. Okay, consumers are willing to pay higher prices. Is this good for producer? What is their cost of production? So we compare the cost of production between control and trial, and you will see funny. One is the trial 9 months, another one is trial 12 months. Why trial 12 months? Normally it's the 9 months, but in our case, we were just forced our producers to continue for 12 months, as we did it. In our cases, we see different production cost. Overall, what we see that cost of production per kilo of fish produced does not increase due to the adoption of this practice. In many cases, it increase. In many cases, it does not increase, except for rohu. The cost of production per kilo of rohu slightly increase, as you'll see here. But at the same time, rohu, when we have 12 months production, their price is also higher because consumers are willing to pay higher price for a bigger fish. So again, what are the take-home messages? The take-home messages is that consumers are willing to pay higher prices for safer fish produced using the good aquaculture practices. Unit per cost per unit of production does not increase with the adoption of these best practices or good aquaculture practices. I emphasize it does not. And the market price is higher for safer fish producing good aquaculture practices. Then market demand can be segmented by different groups of consumers. Some are high food safety concerned consumers, and others are low food safety concerned consumers. And we try to institutionalize the results. We have been working with stakeholders from the get-go, from the beginning of the projects, and we are institutionalizing this with the Bangladesh Food Safety Authority, Department of Fisheries, and other government agencies, including the Planning Commission. And we are developing a public-private partnership. And as I said, one feed company joined with us, that's the Mega Feeds, and there is a potential to further extend that partnership. And we need to broaden the training on good aquaculture practices and extension capacities of the Department of Fisheries, universities, and NGO. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Day. And I would like to invite our panelists to turn on your videos and join us for a panel discussion. We've had a tremendous amount of participation from our audience in the Q&A. And so I would like to actually kick us off with a question directed to Aditya. On the policy side and implications, how were your findings received or accepted by the government of Nepal, and how may it impact their efforts to strengthen food safety initiatives?
Yeah, thank you, Haley. So that is very good question. And we recently had policy consultation, a policy workshop in Nepal as part of the project. So in Nepal, it requires, specifically on microbiological risk perspectives of the food safety, it requires level of awareness. Not, as I said, not only in the producers and consumers, but also in government level also. So we're trying to do have a broader discussion on those food safety, so that the food policy will address those food safety as an important priority there. So overall, it was very positively received, but depending on the level of understanding of the different partners from the stakeholders of the government, and also I recall that our first visit with government offices with you, Dr. Haley, their first question was, oh, okay, is it about the pesticidal residual testing? So they are more aware, or maybe it's news and media is highlighting more on that chemical side, chemical contamination risk, they are relatively more aware about that, but microbial contamination side is relatively, you know, less emphasized and even less awareness on that.
It might be less emphasized. I mean, all of them are important together, but and I guess I would highlight that the Food Safety Innovation Lab has had a large focus on microbial hazards. And why is that? Well, it seems to be the less obvious among the food safety hazards, yet among the greatest hazards. And I think that really is rooted in the fact that, you know, you can see pesticide application, you can see fungal growth and therefore mycotoxin production on corn, but you can't see E. coli and you can't see salmonella. And so that invisibleness, I think, has contributed to the reduced awareness of these organisms. And I think it's an important part of what we do to continue to highlight that, that risk. I have a question for Paul, if he's available. I know it. Here you're spotlighted, Paul. And it's how feasible is modeling complex human behaviors to influence food safety and food handling practices?
Pretty practical. I think it's when we do it, we're not looking at a whole host of food safety practices. So we're looking usually at specific practices. It might be something like cleaning and disinfecting, or it's a very confined behavior. So that's how we're doing it. And it's that model that we have is simplified for understanding, but it's fueled by some pretty complex behavior theories. So I think it's really appropriate. It's been used, that COM-B model was used more extensively in healthcare systems, you know, looking at maybe why nurses don't wash their hands as much as they're supposed to, or things, why people don't use proper needle protocols. So it's looking at, so in that case, it's looking largely at compliance. So we're just taking it and moving it over to these other behaviors that are not more or less complex than those.
Well, and it's just such an important piece of what we do at trying to capture the behavior change and human behavior, because we can do testing all day. I can find you salmonella, I can find you E. coli all day, but so what? You know, if people don't care, if we can't understand the levers that we can pull to influence, you know, positive behavior change, I guess it doesn't matter. So really important work that your group's done. We thank you for that, Paul.
Thank you.
Jessica, a question for you. These are great questions. How are women managing the mini dairies? Are they doing it as a group? Do they form cooperatives? Do they have the power to make any decisions, or are they only managing on behalf of their communities?
Yeah, thank you. I was starting to answer that by text, but it's easier to do it this way. So yeah, I think the mini dairies are an area actually where we have see a significant amount of women's control, I think, relative to other economic activities in Senegal, which is why we were kind of excited to focus on it. So most of these mini dairies, they are cooperative enterprises. So they usually have a management entity. They vary in size. They're not big. I think the largest one maybe involved 15 co-owners. They are historically and still for the most part run by women-only groups, but there are definitely some mixed, some men and women run businesses as well. And increasingly we are seeing some sort of male-only run businesses or mini dairies cropping up. And only one of the 9 of the women that we spoke to, only one of them reported that she doesn't have full control over the income that she makes from the dairy business. So yeah, that's a good situation. The situation is quite different, I think, at the level of the producer households, where you have women getting involved in dairy production at the milking stage through processing and sale, but they have almost no control over herd management, vaccines, where the cows are at any given moment, if they're taken, you know, if they're taken on transhumance or migration. And often less control over the income that they're getting from the sales of the milk as well. And then when they're not involved in transport to market, I think that's where you get a lot more sort of male crowding in and control over the income. But yeah, thanks for that question.
Yeah, great question, wasn't it? Dr. Day, a question for you. Why was the cost of production using good aquaculture practices less than the conventional production practices, and what were those drivers?
Thank you. It's a good question, very good question. There are two components to it. One is that when we have a cleaner production environment, safe, water quality is better, less pollution in the water, etc., the fish grew much faster. So interesting point is this is a good aquaculture practices. It's not a rocket science. It just, don't put this and that in the pond, don't have this water coming from the rice field, etc., etc. So the cleaner environment makes fish happy, I'm just assuming, and then they grow faster. And the second component of that is that the feed cost. Feed is the most important cost item. We, as I briefly mentioned in the presentation, we collaborated with a feed industry. That feed industry, what they did, we said, okay, look at all this ingredient you might be using. Do we need this kind of antibiotic as a prophylaxis, etc., etc.? So what they have done, they have taken out some of the quote unquote, I think it's unnecessary additives in the feed ingredient. As a result, they were able to sell the fish feed about 5 to 7 taka less. So that also helps. So one, fish grew faster, and then the second is that cost of production decreased, but primarily because of the feed cost. Thank you. It's a really, really, really good question.
Yeah, it makes sense. It sounds like it might have been a perfect storm and a storm we need to keep pursuing.
Right.
DT, a question for you is, what were the potential high impact consumer knowledge gaps? And how can we create awareness for food safety in Nepal?
Consumer knowledge gap, we through our consumer household survey and also among the youth, we did some experiment about the awareness. So like in producer side, so we found that even on the consumer level, so they have poor understanding on like relatively unobservable attributes, which is microbiological risk, as compared to the attributes that directly they see, like observable attributes, like mole growth or like deformed size. They are more aware. But the other side of it is also that at least some segment of the consumers, among the urban consumers, we found that there is higher willingness to pay for the safer fresh produce. So on increasing the awareness among the consumers, I think the high end gap is to educate them more on microbial contamination risks and how poorly addressing that could lead to foodborne illnesses. So increasing awareness on that aspect. So it could be through different means, probably awareness campaign, the training for consumers as well about the safely handling practices, or how before consumption, what you need to do if you are consuming raw. So those are some of the aspects I see on consumer level.
And I think in that same vein, and I know you responded a bit to this already in the Q&A panel, but I think it's certainly worth elevating discussion and input from other panelists here is, will the additional cost for providing safe foods not further exacerbate the challenge of food security, especially among consumers in the low income bracket? So the question is, will that happen? Do you have thoughts on that you'd share? And I'd certainly welcome comments from other panelists in this as well.
Yes, definitely there will be additional cost, as we know, to maintain food safety. Depending on the food systems, it could be higher or the lower relatively. But as we concentrate about the broader definition of food security, which the food supplied should be safe, it should be nutritious. So not just about the meeting hunger necessarily, right? So if the food supplied is not safe, it may further, bring the foodborne illnesses there. So with that standpoint, it would be challenging for with the additional costs. So it will be challenging for low income brackets, but the other side of it is it's kind of an indispensable part of having a food consumption. It should be a safe food, right? So with that, there is no exact answer to it. And then yeah, I welcome others to chime in here. But yeah, so there's additional cost and it would be challenging for low income brackets. But at least we can start. I mean, one of the sort of our research has shown that with income or like different segments of the market, we can target with those consumers relatively demanding higher, at least some segments of the consumers we can with, and then with the increased level of awareness that this having safer food is equally important, not just the hunger reduction. Probably it will elaborate more to a broader adoption of that. So yeah, thank you, Haley. So
any other comments from the other panelists? I can talk for days on this, or at least share my manifestos, but I'd certainly open the floor. I think Paul might be saying something. There you go. One more time.
Okay.
There we go.
The cost is big. So you have, if you have this behavior that is an additional cost, that can be very demotivating. So I think when you look at this big body of practices that people could do, one of them is cost. I think, and this relates back to the chemical versus microbial, what we see in different places and in the United States as well is not really having a good understanding of the consequences of eating contaminated food contaminated with microbial pathogens, because you can get diarrhea from a lot of things. And you might not, very often don't attribute it that it came from food. With the difference with a chemical contamination, so say you have methanol poisoning from homemade wine or something like that, that's super easily traceable. And it probably happened at an event, and the consequences are extreme, like people die. So I think there has to be a lot of work in just perceptions and making the connection between the contaminated food and the consequences of eating that contaminated food. Because most often, and I don't want to say most often, I don't have the statistics, but very often people get sick and they attribute it to something else, especially if it's something simple like self-limiting diarrhea. So these all feed into whether someone is willing or capable of doing something about the problem. Generally, people don't spend a lot of energy and money fixing a problem they don't know exists.
Exactly. No, well said. And even though I think ever since 2010, it was declared food safety is a human right, doesn't mean we're actually have all of the solutions in place. I think we're better understanding what the drivers or contributors are to that or to achieving that, but there's still some, whether it be policy, private sector, education and capacity, all of those have to be elevated in order to actually achieve that bigger goal.
Yeah, I just like to add my 2 cents on that. And as you probably have seen, when we had the 3 species, tilapia, rohu, and pangasius, the incremental increase in willingness to pay was lower for the pangasius. The reason is that that's the fish normally consumed by the poorer consumer. So we have to see who would be willing to pay for higher prices, etc., etc. In general, it would be the upper income class or middle income class, maybe not very poor, because they are probably food security is more concerned. But here I just like to add, I answered that question someone asked in the chat. is that women, because we had this experimental auction where women's are, in terms of the income, similar to the poorest maid, but still they are willing to pay higher because they said it. And probably our presenter, Dr. Samina Luthma, will mention that in the next webinar. Is that the women said, oh, I need to take care of my family. I am more concerned about my children, and they are willing to pay. In spite of their lower income, they are willing to pay. So education is an important factor. That's what we found. I did not present today in the knowledge, attitude, and practice survey. But yes, if we could motivate the consumers, it's not a binary choice that food safety versus food security. It is not a binary choice. But we have an option to deal with both. Thank you.
I appreciate that you landed on the world is not done in black and white. That's just what I heard. Jessica, a question for you. Are the gender issues related to food safety you observed in Senegal similar across the board, or are they country specific? And would the solutions that work in Senegal be easily transferable to other countries in the region or other regions?
I mean, that's a good question. Obviously, we did this, let's say I only have expertise doing this research in Senegal, and so I don't feel very comfortable speaking to the generalizability. But based on my experience studying gender issues and other value chains on the continent, I would say that they're probably fairly similar. Yeah, that would be my assumption, but I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, I would share that hypothesis. I think that's what we might see, but yeah. I mean, will there be nuances? Certainly. Is it a function of scale and nuances to culture? Certainly.
Exactly. I do think that from what I've read in the literature, that historically the West African dairy production and processing systems are fairly similar. So they're using similar technologies, plants are fairly similar, climates are fairly similar. And so that aspects I think would carry across to the last discussion. I work also in peanuts, where we've faced this issue of aflatoxin, which is also very difficult to get people to care about because it often, the effects don't show up until you get liver cancer in your old age in some cases. And we had a project in Ghana that was focused on that kind of consumer side of things. And so the project trained processors of this peanut-based low-cost snack that's available in markets. They trained them on aflatoxin reduction strategies and then tested their products and gave them a sign that they could put up outside their little shop in the market that had a grade and the training certificate. And they found in that study that did influence consumer behavior and eventually this sort of like convergence on improved practices. So I think there are things like that. And then lastly, I think probably we also need to do a bit more research ourselves on low-cost adoptable strategies that actually work in the communities that we're in. And again, just doing background research associated with this project, it turns out that traditionally women use these calabashes or gourds to create this fermented milk that people really like. And it happens to be that calabash has antibacterial properties in it. And so I think looking at indigenous systems, people have been working in these sectors and largely surviving. And so I think, turning to the communities for practices that they already use and trying to sustain those is a good idea too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it also leads into what'll probably be our near final question, but it was really directed at Paul. But your point on indigenous, on simplification, could easier uptake in food safety practices be achieved by simplifying the various food safety practices, mitigating the acceptance and/or implementation of these practices?
Absolutely. Yeah. If something's easy to do, people know how they do it. They're psychologically, they believe they can do it. That's much smaller hurdle. And to piggyback on what Jessica said, yeah, there is context, and we did another study looking at kind of food safety culture among Dominicans in Dominican Republic, and in some categories, a lot of awareness. For instance, cross-contamination, a lot of awareness. So that's been passed on or talked about at least. So in some cases, rely on that and build on that. That part of knowledge or awareness that people already have. But you do have to, there is context though. So you do have to do some background there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to thank everyone here for your generosity of time, but also the tremendous amount of work that you've done in country and contributed to the research portfolio of the Food Safety Innovation Lab. So thank you to our speakers, our attendees, and certainly to USAID and the Feed the Future mechanism that allows us to conduct this critical research to better understand what the barriers are to actually achieving our larger goals in food safety. We should have a link in the chat to a webinar, and presentations will be shared by email, and we invite you to join us for next Wednesday's webinar, and a link to that will be available in the chat. Thank you again, everyone, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you as well.
Thank you, Ellie. Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.